For the last 3 years, I've been travelling the world to discover and tell the incredible story of how beer built and changed the world. From the dusty dunes of the Egyptian desert to the frozen wilderness of Arctic Svalbard, as well as more likely places like Munich's beer halls and St. Louis's beer cathedrals. I've come to believe that the creation of beer and wider fermentation is as important to human development as the discovery of fire. The list of achievements made in the pursuit of better beer is mind-bending. We invented refrigeration to keep lager cellars cool, adopted pasteurisation to keep beer fresh, and laid railways to take it places quicker. Beer has inspired some other great discoveries, including germ theory of disease, and brewer's yeast is now used to create vaccines, insulin, and even biofuels. All along, breweries have sponsored sports and TV, funded political parties, and influenced cultures and cuisines. All these stories and many more are told in my new book, The Meaning of Beer, out on the 7th of November 2024. Buy your copy today, right after you watch this week's episode inspired by one of the chapters. Did you ever think you'd see the day where this beer appeared on the craft beer channel in front of us?
No, not in such a monolithic...
Yeah, literally the only beer we're going to drink in this episode.
It made it look incredibly important and grandiose.
Well, it is pretty important. I would firstly say, so I went to St. Louis while researching this book. St. Louis is a great town. I had one of the best sandwiches of my life and an incredible, incredible tour of the Budweiser plant. The scale of it is unlike anything I can really explain. Like tanks, 50 times your height, 100 times your length. It feels like a movie set. Like outside is so perfect, so beautifully constructed, which was very much part of the Budweiser kind of brand, like to look like the perfect utopian place. And you know, like there's artworks on the wall in the brew house. I'll put some photos up that are probably worth millions, and that's in the brew house, let alone boardrooms and stuff.
Not steamy.
Oh well, I mean it's very contained brew house.
Sure.
And like wrought ironwork and gold chandeliers. It's just unlike anything. But the story of Budweiser and the impact it's had on American culture. And I'm sure there'll be people out there that will be saying, you know, there are other beers that had a huge impact on American culture. You know, obviously Miller, Coors, Pabst, these kind of brands. But as we're about to discover, Miller, Coors, Pabst, Anheuser-Busch, all of these people are German immigrants.
Yeah, sounds it.
So American brewing culture was basically founded by the Germans, which means that, and this is what this whole episode is going to be about, American popular culture was founded, influenced by German immigrants. Sport was funded by German immigrants. TV funded by German immigrants. And just the amount of influence that a handful of breweries have had in America, all German immigrants, is going to blow your minds by the end of this episode.
I'm here. Let's do it.
This says it's a twist cap. And it is.
Never trust a beer that you can do that to.
See that immediately reminds me of America, an episode of Friends where they get a beer out of the fridge and just twist it. We just don't have that in the UK.
No, it's wild.
So, Budweiser, get it down, your boy. St. Louis, 1860. That's when Anheuser-Busch as an entity was founded. Mm-hmm. It was actually Anheuser, the founder, he bought a brewery called the Bavarian Brewery that was struggling.
Right.
He basically lent them a load of money. They defaulted on the loan and he was like, well, I'll have the brewery then, please. So it's a pretty low risk venture really for him. And none of this might have happened if he hadn't met Mr. Bush. So Mr. Bush wanted to marry his daughter, and he was a brewing supplies salesman. So he was selling stuff for breweries. He met Anheuser's daughter, wanted to marry her, and also probably wanted to do a bit of business. Yeah. But actually, as he was marrying into the family, he was sort of inducted into what then was Anheuser Brewing. And he was so impressive as a human that he quickly rose to the top and quickly became sort of the well, his name was added to the brewery only 15 years later, 14 years later.
Wow.
So he had an incredible impact. And that incredible impact came partly from the fact that he'd come over later. So he was a little bit younger. He came over in 1857 from Germany. So he had seen the Pale Lager Revolution. The Germans that came over, and they came over in their millions throughout the 19th century because of political turmoil in Germany at that time, they'd only seen sort of the darker lagers. So Adolphus Busch, he has, I guess, a different idea of how things could go.
Yeah.
He has, I think, a bit more ambition because Eberhard Anheuser was, he had lots of different business. He made his money in soap manufacture. In fact, his son tried to do the same in California, and it went so wrong that Eberhard never trusted him again with his money, which is another reason why I think Adolphus rose so fast. But the story of Budweiser, which is almost, I think most people probably think that's the name of the brewery, but it was Anheuser-Busch and then it was AB InBev. The story of Budweiser starts with Adolphus and his mate Karl Conrad. So Karl Conrad was a wine importer who wanted to have a beer brand, I guess, to sell in with his wines. So they both were aware of pale lagers. It's said that Karl Conrad had been traveling through the Czech Republic. He'd gone to a monastery and he tasted the best beer he'd ever had, which was like a pale lager. And he wanted to create that for the American market. The problem with that, the reason it hadn't been done before, is because the American malts that were being used were much, much heavier in protein, not so good for brewing, and what you resulted in was a hazier beer. So they didn't look so good in the glass, they didn't taste so good, so they needed to find a way around this. And this was where the real innovation of Budweiser came. So lots of breweries were adding maize, which was actually, the biggest growing crop in America. It's why, whiskies of certain types are still huge in America and were at the time. Americans at the time did not drink beer. It's important to point out. They drank, on average, it was a teaspoon per person in the mid 1800s. They were drinking whiskey, and they were drinking way, way, way too much whiskey. Which was kind of the origin of the temperance movement. It wasn't initially a move against beer, but we'll get to it, and it definitely was in the end. So there wasn't much beer being brewed. It was all German immigrants that were doing it, and they were struggling with the American ingredients. So lots of them started adding maize because that was what was available. But Karl Conrad and Adolphus used rice.
Rice.
Which is more expensive, kind of gelatinous, so hard to brew with, but it didn't give a really corny flavour.
Yeah.
And you resulted in this beautiful crystal clear beer.
So no haze.
So no haze at all.
Oh, wow.
So the maize lagers were very popular, they still are today.
Yep.
But rice was actually considered at the time, I think, the superior thing to use. And that's what they did. And they had huge success with this. They named it Budweiser, probably to try and evoke the reputation, say, of Budvar or of the town of Budweiser at the very least. And we'll get onto the IP issue later. It was incredibly popular. They sold millions and millions of bottles in just a couple of years. It would have been the making of Karl Conrad, but for some reason, so I was in the archives of Budweiser trying to figure this out. I asked Tracy and Michael, who were very kindly hosting me, quite why he went under. We're not entirely sure. We think it might have been related to possibly the cost of bottles.
Right.
Skyrocketing the cost of glass and that taking him down. But basically what happened is when he went down, he sold the rights back to Anheuser-Busch.
Never sell the rice.
So they got this incredibly successful brand, probably at quite a good price. Although I'm sure that Karl Conrad did fine out of it because he was an old friend. So that's how Budweiser becomes an exclusively Anheuser-Busch beer, and it grows incredibly quickly. So Eberhard sadly dies not long after this is released, but that is probably good, really, for Anheuser-Busch because it means that Busch is now completely in control.
Yes.
He invested all the things that he knows are happening in Germany. So he learns of Louis Pasteur and pasteurization. He learns of ice manufacture from these refrigeration machines, the work of Linda and Sedelmeier, and he takes that even further. So he gets an American-made one, I think it is,
right.
An American-made fridge, and then he starts producing ice, which he packs into his railway cars, which are also containing pasteurized beer, which means he can ship his beer all over the US and it will taste great.
Wild.
Which other people weren't really hot on.
Yeah.
So it became one of about 5 what were known back then as shipping breweries, so where you could get it anywhere in the US.
This is literally like Wild West times almost, where steam trains is how people go around. And yeah, he's got refrigerated
Refrigerated cars.
cars.
Yeah. So, like, you know, he's not inventing that, but he is at the forefront of it. And he's also investing in railways. He's building his own railways all around his campus in St. Louis. So he is technologically incredibly forward-thinking. And this is why Budweiser gets the edge. And by the early 20th century, it's the biggest brewery in the world. But it all goes wrong with the First World War. A, rationing, and B, a literal racist kickback against Germans. So if you're a German heritage, you were at war with Germany.
Yeah.
A lot of suspicion. There were beatings, muggings, boycotts going on. And that's actually what also helped lead to prohibition. So prohibition had been a movement for like a century, and they'd never got it over the line, largely to do with Irish, German, and to some extent Italian immigrants, you know, voting against that locally.
Yes.
But once the Germans were sidelined, politically, that power sort of started to fade. And then you also have to add in the fact that the grain was needed for the war effort. It was not seen as a priority because beer was now not something you needed to survive. It was a treat by this time. So when the war effort came, there were bigger things that we needed the grain for. The Germans had lost the impact that they had. And we end up in 1920, 1921 with prohibition, which nearly takes the brewery down. They switched to making low alcohol beer. But the real impact of Budweiser outside of brewing starts to happen here. So what you've got post-prohibition is you've only got a couple of breweries left. All of them have caught up technologically with Budweiser. So they're all shipping it in ice cars. They're all, well, they're post-steam now. They're all pasteurizing their beers to get it right, and they're all making beautiful crystal clear beer, whether it's maize or it's rice that they're using to do so. So what happens is all the beers are the same. They can all ship it all over the country. So how do you set yourself apart?
Probably advertising.
Yeah, exactly. Advertising and marketing. So we start to see this humongous boom in beer advertising. The first televisions were all put in bars. Yeah. So you would go to the bar to watch telly, to watch certain things, and particularly you go there to watch sport. So what we've got is just after the Second World War, you've got tellies in pretty much all pubs, and you've got people going there to watch the sport. And the brewers recognise that, you know, print advertising is great, but wouldn't it be great to advertise to people while they're sat there choosing what beer to drink? So you get some earlier breweries that sadly don't exist anymore, starting to invest in TV advertising. And they start with just putting hoardings on the actual pitch. You know, like we see now today everywhere, because that would have been shown on the telly. But they soon move on to advertising in the breaks, which obviously, you know, with the Super Bowl has a huge heritage of that, and also sponsoring certain things. So there's a great moment in the book when we talk about like the origins of sort of advertising. So Narragansett Brewing in Rhode Island, which does still exist. So they were the first to see the potential for advertising on telly during sport. And they put hoardings up on in the Red Sox stadium, and they got it for free because, this is a direct quote, there's a Red Sox exec put it, he said, "You don't know what we're doing, and nor do we. So just have the advertising." So they start advertising sport, and they start advertising, you know, on, I guess, like soap operas, comedy shows, all this kind of stuff that was also cropping up on TV at the time. And then the TV moves into the home, and that's a huge, huge benefit. And suddenly you see these adverts start to change from like sporty men doing things to appealing to the women as well. Not necessarily as drinkers, although quite often they were, more as sort of, you know, as the buyer for the household. You know, they bought the beer, so you advertise to them and they'll be like, "Oh, I thought I'd get you this."
How to please your man.
Yes,
sort of things.
like in modern terms, incredibly sexist stuff. But I mean, to be fair, a lot of the breweries were also, you know, the woman would be stood there with like a flute of Budweiser with the man as well, and it would be like very much keeping up with the Joneses vibes, like a beautiful ham on the table.
Yeah, aspirational.
Exactly,
beer.
middle class American dream kind of vibes. So obviously that has a huge impact. You know, beer is one of the first things to advertise on telly, along with cigarettes. So what we get to is a point where Budweiser goes on a huge spending spree to keep up with all the other breweries that are doing it right. And I'm just going to have to read it out because there's so many statistics in this. So there comes a point where Budweiser is sponsoring 90% of the nation's professional sports brands. 90% of them.
90% of the brands?
Yeah.
So like all of the teams, basically.
All the teams, all the sports.
Wow.
So check this out. In 1990, so as recent as 1990, Anheuser-Busch sponsored 23 of the 24 Major League Baseball teams, 18 of the 24 national football teams, 22 of the 27 national basketball teams, and 13 of the 14 domestic National Hockey League teams. On top of that, Gussie Busch, the CEO, literally owned the St. Louis Cardinals,
Yes.
and they had exclusive rights to advertise on the Super Bowl.
Wow.
So this is exclusive alcohol rights.
Yes.
Sorry.
Right. Yeah.
And that
For years.
up until 2022.
No way.
So very recently disappeared.
Wow.
So what
Wow.
that means is not only were they funding all of these very big sports, but they are also funding niche sports. So things like drag racing, all those kind of American sports that just don't exist anywhere else.
Yeah.
They were also sponsoring those. To the point where there's another great quote, which I think was in Mark Dredge's book, again, Brief History of Lager, it's amazing, read it, where there's a quote from a Budweiser exec. He's saying that he was once flicking channels in a hotel room and he came across a duck race that was sponsored by Budweiser. This is the level that they were going to.
Wow. Amazing.
So that is how much money was pouring from brewing into niche sports and into TV at the time.
Yeah.
And you can't calculate the impact that that would have had. Would drag racing even exist if it weren't for the fact that breweries were ploughing money into it?
Well, there's that impact on, sports culture, but also the power of almost being brainwashed by flicking through the channels and seeing everything, Bud,
Yeah.
has that effect of thinking it must be superior, it must be the best.
Yeah.
Because it's everywhere.
Exactly. And
They've got so much money to do all these things. They're doing such great things in the world.
there were other breweries doing that,
Yeah.
but it was only 4 or 5 of them, which is why you see, again, this huge drop-off in breweries, because they just can't compete with the shipping breweries with those budgets.
Yeah.
And it was essentially a war of attrition in terms of marketing. But as a result of that, what we end up is a huge impact on popular culture generally. So I have a whole chapter on The Simpsons and Duff. So Duff is sort of based on Budweiser, essentially, which is made even more clearer. So Shelbyville has a beer that's called Fudd, which is even closer to Bud. But it was sort of supposed to be this everyman drink that everybody drank and didn't really understand why. Just their loyalty was there to a sort of fault.
Yeah.
I don't know if you like some of my favorite episodes. Like there's the Duff tour with the Duff Light, Duff Dry, and Duff going into this, coming from the same place.
Yeah.
All these incredible gags about the advertising as well when they do that tour. But The Simpsons. If you name, if you ask somebody to name 20 things from The Simpsons, I'm fairly certain Duff would be one of them. And Duff Man, which is based on Budman.
Budman.
Yeah.
Really?
So Budman is like this slightly rotund. Well, he starts off in like the 60s as like a rotund, kind of like cosplay dad.
Okay.
But he gets more and more buff as sort of the aspiration really kicks in.
Budman turns to Buffman.
Buffman, yeah. Oh, nice, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
should have been in the book. So yeah, I mean, and that all sort of came from Bud. And then you also see this proliferation of beer culture in TV, like fictional TV. So obviously, I referenced the Friends earlier and this idea of twisting it open, just feeling American. The idea of the six-pack.
Yeah.
I write about the Truman Show. There's that scene in the Truman Show where his best friend takes him to the river and tries to talk him out of thinking he's part of a TV show.
Yeah.
And like the device in that is a sixer. It's like we go down, we drink 6 beers. So yeah, like the story I wanted to tell with Budweiser here is just how important that German immigration was in the 19th century, and how 5 or 6 German immigrants essentially created beer and pub culture. And there's also a chapter about Chicago where this was really apparent, because you have what was called the beer riots, where the Nativism movement, essentially people that believe that because they got off the boat in 1622, is it? They had sort of divine rights to the identity of Americanism, and the people coming in the 19th century didn't. And that got tied up with prohibitionist movements, temperance movement. And so they essentially started attacking Irish and German and Italian rights, one of which was in Chicago. They raised the licensing, because most of the bars were owned by Germans in Chicago. They sextupled the cost of having an alcohol license to try and get rid of the Germans, and there were riots in which people died. And then a year later, everything was reversed and things went back to normal for a bit. So, this was so much a part of the German identity that it influenced all of American identity, and that, people were willing to die to drink the beer of their homeland, because they didn't want to leave Germany. They were forced to by the situation there. So, it's one of the biggest, I think, we talk about America being a nation of immigrants. And this is exactly what we mean. Their beer culture, their pub culture, their bar culture comes from 5 or 6 Germans that came over in the mid-19th century.
So they're Germans, Johnny, but they've named their beer after a region in the Czech Republic.
Yes. You want to get into the IP stuff?
Maybe.
Let's do it.
Budweiser.
See, that's the issue.
God
yeah.
damn. It's Budvar, isn't it? It's from Budjovice.
Yeah.
It's in the Czech Republic. That's what the name derives from.
Yeah, so I think I said earlier, like Karl Konrad and Adolphus Busch called it Budweiser because Budweis had a name for itself as a great brewing town. There's no evidence we can find that either Adolphus or Karl ever went to Budweis or Budjovice. Budweis is the German name for Budjovice. So they called it that to sort of get a bit of cultural cachet. This therefore creates the IP issue that we have. Do you want to grab Budvar just off screen? Yeah. So lots of people would assume that this brand existed first and these guys copied it. That's not true.
No.
This is about 30 years older, 25 years older.
That's where it gets a little bit sticky.
Yeah. So Budweiser as a beer brand, this has the rights. The issue is that calling it Budweiser implies it's from the town of Budweis, which is obviously upsetting to the people of Budweis and to a brewery that is called Budvar, but wants to put that it's from Budweis on the can. So Budweiser. So in America, this is called Czechvar, a portmanteau of Czech brewery. And in parts of Central Europe, this is called Bud.
Yeah.
Because they can't put the Weiser on. And they are locked in what I think is the longest IEP dispute in history.
And they've both got great claims to it. Right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not like somebody came along and copied. The issue is the use of the town name by these guys and the use of their own town name as far as these guys are concerned. And that's why it's never been resolved. Because how can you say to a town, you don't have the rights to your town? And how can you say to these guys, you don't have the rights to something that you had for 25 years before these guys came along?
It's wild how similar the logos are.
Yeah.
And the color palettes they've chosen. There's almost like a mutual, like, they're doing this together. They're coming together a little bit. They hate each other, but they're also
pushing to try and claim that IP space, aren't they?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
And I know, they wouldn't tell us what, but when we were at Budvar, they were like, we have a whole forward strategy for the coming years as to how we deal with this, both legally and branding wise. And this would have resulted in why Budvar was probably never sold, because then AB InBev would have swallowed it up and taken that brand.
Yeah.
But it's also, so there's the King of Beers thing. So this was the beer of kings. It was referred to as that because it was sold to the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs like this beer, which some people claim is where the King of Beers thing comes from.
Yeah.
I would argue it would have been tough for them to know that that was the reputation and the name for it in the Czech Republic. And actually, possibly more likely is that the King of Beers was a nickname for Adolphus, who A, was, the biggest brewing magnate in America, but B, was supposedly very generous. So around St. Louis, he was known as like philanthropic. He was known for like, if he was in a bar you were in, nobody paid for beers that night. So he had the nickname King of Beers, which maybe posthumously was applied to the beer. So it might not be part of this IP sort of dispute, and they don't use the Beer of Kings anymore, if they ever did at all officially. So yeah, I mean, these two brands are kind of inseparable. Obviously, they both want it to end. But I kind of like this dispute because I think it talks to the history, the importance, and the identity of both these people.
Yeah. It's old world, new world, but also both republics.
Yeah.
So like they're both, this is a republic from several different empires, and these guys went to found America, well, modern America.
Yeah, to found modern American identity.
To escape from persecution, religious persecution and political persecution.
Yeah, political very much, yeah.
So it's interesting to me that the two most political beers maybe in the world, no, I don't know about that, but two very political beers are also kind of enemies, but they've got this sort of common ground.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Absolutely. And just to talk about the beer, so I did the tour, I got a pour at the end of it. The beer that came out of the tank was a really tasty beer. And I learned some really interesting things about Budweiser, both, obviously the history that we've just gone through, but also stuff like, so they still spond. They still use these natural processes. The oak, sorry, not the oak wood, the beechwood chips, they are basically nucleation points for the yeast. They're not affecting the flavour, but it's an old thing that they haven't found a better, well, maybe they have found a better use for, but they've kept it because of the history. And I've seen the oak chips, they're like spirals. And there's stuff of interest and intrigue at Budweiser that made me gain a bit of respect for the way that it's brewed, the company that it is. I mean, not necessarily AB InBev, but the people that work and love, the people that I met love Budweiser. They love that brand, they love being there. It's an incredibly important beer. It just might not be what you love to drink, but equally, again, if I was going to drink a 5% light lager, it would be Bud, or according to my blind taste test, it would be Heineken.
There you go.
They're decent beers at what they are, and the history of it is just, well, I hope you agree, absolutely fucking fascinating.
Yeah.